All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Jeannie Hannon. I am the Director of Programs for A Time to Heal Cancer Foundation. We're excited that you're joining us today for this session, The Healing Power of Connection. And I am super excited to introduce our guest speaker today. Thomas L. Lenz has a doctorate in pharmacy, and he is a fellow with the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. Dr. Lenz is a tenured professor at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. He is the director of the Master of Science program in Integrative Health and Wellness and Lifestyle Medicine Graduate Certificate Program. Dr. Lenz has published over 100 articles and 6 books on the topics of lifestyle medicine, well-being, chronic illness, cardiovascular pharmacotherapy, pedagogy, and chronic disease prevention. The title of his most recent book, published in 2023, is Posturing Towards Wholeness, or Radical Way Forward to Living Well as a Healthcare Professional. But I also am going to throw in some personal introduction here because I have the pleasure of working for Dr. Lenz as I am adjunct at Creighton in his program. And I can tell you that the topic of connection and compassion, Dr. Lenz just eludes that. He is one of the most kind, compassionate people I know. We are so lucky to have him today. So, Dr. Lenz, thank you very much, and I will turn it over to you.
That was far too kind, Jeannie. But thank you. That was really nice, and I'm super happy to be with you all. And thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to share some of what I've been working on and what I feel like is important relative to health and healthcare and healing. And so I think from a roadmap side, we're planning on about an hour of material. My lecture style is really laid back. So if you have a question and want to interrupt, you will certainly not offend me or hurt my feelings in any way if you just blurt it out. Or you can put it in the chat and we can wait till the end, or we can do questions throughout. Whatever format this is for you, and so whatever makes most sense for you is what I feel like is probably best format here. Um, I always feel like it's a good idea to give a little background about how I got here and why this material is starting to make sense for me on telling a story about something bigger relative to our health, because I think it gives some context to what I'm going to show you. So as Jeannie said, my background, well, I always say I grew up in pharmacy practice academically, and I was there about 15 years or so. Most of the work that I did as a pharmacist was in de-prescribing, so working with patients who had, oh, sorry, my dog must be going out. I gotta mute my phone. Most of the work I did as a pharmacist was de-prescribing, and so I'd work with patients who had chronic illness and pulling medicine away and replacing that with other modalities that could help with blood pressure or cholesterol or blood sugar levels or that kind of thing. That led me to looking more closely at prevention and trying to get to the root cause of illness. So about, gosh, 10 years or so ago, I was invited to create some new programming at Creighton, new undergrad and graduate education in disease prevention. And my research was really centered around how chronic stress leads to chronic illness. I went on sabbatical then in 2019 and did some research and wrote a book following that called Chronically American. And it really outlined how our everyday way of life leads to and is surrounded by chronic stress, and that has a very clear pathophysiological connection to chronic illnesses of all kinds, particularly when we look at diabetes or obesity or high blood pressure or mental health like depression and anxiety and so forth. And so that's where I spent a big chunk of my time looking at chronic stress and how we live our lives as Americans. And I in the interim, went back to school and got a degree in medical anthropology so I could understand this from a social science broader scope. And it was really helpful to make some connections to understand the social context and how that influences us. And this is really getting to the heart of what connectedness means for me and how we are getting or not getting connectedness through our social experiences in our healthcare system. So then that research and experience moved me into a space of looking at this from a relationship side. And our chronic illness, our chronic stress, leading chronic illness really has something a lot to do with our relationships with other people, our relationships with ourselves, our relationships with God or our higher power in every context you could imagine, our relationship with nature. And so there's so much there to talk about. Today, we're really probably focused just on person-to-person relationships and how that helps us in healing. But I'll mention many other of these other areas at the same time to give some fuller context there. So then, as the story goes, that actually then led to looking at compassion as I'm going to just call it a serious modality. We're going to take it seriously from a healthcare provider standpoint as something that we know was very effective in helping people heal. Because to me, compassion means that you're connecting with someone when the other is suffering. And that suffering can be in all kinds of ways, mental, physical, in small ways, big ways. But it essentially is just an exemplar of us connecting with other people. And I think there's a good story to tell relative to that. So most of the work that I do now at Creighton, so I'm in the School of Medicine in the Department of Family and Community Medicine, and most of my work now is working with our student physicians, so our students who are in medical school, and then those who are residents, and then to some degree our attendings, our clinical faculty as well, on compassion and connection to help them understand how they can connect with their patients and with themselves and with their colleagues a bit better so that they can help their patients heal, but at the same time help themselves heal. And that's a fully other side of this that's really important to pay attention to is when a lot of times when we talk about this from a healthcare professional standpoint, we really just focus on what it does for the patient and not so much focus on what this does for the healthcare professional as well. And there's a great deal of data, which I'll only mention tangentially today. I don't have slides on it, but that there's a tremendous amount of data that shows that when we are connecting with other people, and regardless of context, whether it's healthcare or not, that we get a great deal from that, from a healing side, from a health side as well. And I'll show you just very snippets of data on this. But I teach a class to our medical students and to our dental students called Compassion Science. And it really tells a story about connecting with other people when the other person is suffering to some type of degree and how that benefits them from a physiological, from a psychological, but from a well-being side, from the provider side, from the whole system benefits from it because there's a cost saving side to it too. So it's hard not to find a positive piece about connecting and offering compassion to another person. Surprise, surprise, everything your grandma told you was true. That being nice to other people and being compassionate really is a good thing. Um, so I tend to look at it from a science side first because those are the most of my listeners, audience are people who have that mindset, and I appeal to their science side first before then I dive in a little bit deeper in some other ways. So we start with compassion science with our first and second year medical students. Third year students they start going in the clinic at that point in the hospital. And so then we talk with them about working with patients and what that looks like and some techniques that are good to use relative to compassion. And then for our fourth year medical students, I teach a class called Relational Care. And as I joke with them at the beginning of that, I say we're going to finally take self-care seriously, and we're gonna talk about tinkering, which is important, exercise and eating right and getting enough sleep. But we're going to use that as a springboard and move beyond that and hopefully move to an area of transformation. And this is all centered around your ability to connect with other people and have relationships with your patients and your colleagues and your family and friends and so forth. Okay, so how about that for a backdrop? My my wife Nancy always jokes that I probably should get paid by the word because I say too many of them, and that would be a great metric to get paid by if we were able to do it that way. So I think that's a good place to start, anyway, to give you some context about this material. And so what I'd like to show you, okay, so just to give you a little bit more of a roadmap. What I feel like is going on is that we've got tremendous evidence, and I'm going to show you I'm going to show you the science, okay? But I'm tremendous evidence to say this is Tom Len's opinion that something really important is going on foundationally about life and life in every way you could imagine. So, our life as human beings, but plant life, animal life, Mother Earth life, our spiritual life, our emotional, social, every type of way you could describe life that is very fundamentally foundational in connection. So, we're going to start there. And that's most of what I'm gonna talk about today. But what I feel like is happening in and we'll just use our healthcare system, is that there's all kinds of examples for varying reasons of disconnection. So fundamentally, I feel like at our essence, we're relational and connected people to everything, but our systems tend to move us in a disconnected space. And so in some ways, we suffer from that. And that's a different conversation for a different day of what the medical healthcare system does relative to disconnection. But what we are hoping to do and what we are working with our students on is reconnecting them and finding ways to look beyond the healthcare system structural issues and all of the messaging that we get, perhaps from our news media and every other place when we turn the TV or the radio on, that moves us in a disconnected space. It doesn't take long to see that now, but reconnecting brings us back to our core essence, and that has a really uh, what appears to be beneficial component to our health, our not just our mental health and emotional health, but our physical health as well. So that's a bit of the bigger story. And I'm going to start with social science information for you. One of the great books that I read many years ago, published in 2009, were two social scientists, and they wrote a book about how we are connected within our social groups. And there's something, what I felt like was really important about this story. They called these social groups social networks, and you can think of your own social network as your family or social groups that you belong to, a church group, your church community, for perhaps a work group. Maybe it's you go, with people to watch a sporting event. But you could imagine all the different types of groups you are involved in, and those are what Christakis and Fowler called social networks. And they looked at them as if they were human superorganisms because they grow and they shrink over time. They evolve and dissolve when members come and go from the group. There's a flow and a movement within the group. There's something happening that goes within the group, and it has its own structure and function. A couple of the really important parts about our social networks is that the connectedness, the connections between the parts, appears to be really important because there's something that flows between the connections that's sometimes hard for us to describe. But it explains why the whole appears to be greater than the sum of its parts when we look at the whole social network. Um, these are examples of groups, but not really what a social network looks like. So if each dot you're looking at here represents a person, we're not just a group of disconnected, unconnected people with each other. We're connected in some way, but we're not really connected like a bucket brigade where one person is connected to the other, who's connected to the other on down the line. There's something more dynamic to it because two people can be connected to the same person. It's not like a telephone tree where one person is connected to two and then it spreads from there either. There's a back connection to our social networks. And it's not like a military squad either, where that back connection exists, but in a very structured format. Every time Christakis and Fowler looked at examples of social networks, this is what they found. It looks something similar to this. So again, each person represents a dot in this structure. So this is a very dynamic matrix of what they found. And one of the things you might notice from this is that some people tend to cluster in the middle because they feel comfortable in the center of the network where they have many connections. And other people are on the outside and have very few connections. So the people in the middle would kind of know what's going on. Like, and we know, when in our work groups or our family groups where people are in the business and they know everything of what's going on with somebody else, and other people kind of hang on the outside. Some people are, forced to be in the middle. Some people are forced to be on the margins, on the outside. And there's another story to tell about all of that relative to people who live on the margins, on the outside, and have few connections and limited possibilities. But regardless, this is what a social network looks like. And so if you look in the space on the left here where it has an A, this particular person is connected to several people, but then those people are connected back to each other. If you look to other places like B up here, there's another person on the outside, but then, connected to less people. And this is, as I mentioned, every time Christakis and Fowler looked at a social network, it had this type of function and structure. One of the things we think about when we're looking at this from a connectedness side in our healthcare system, we tend to think of our healthcare system like the bucket brigade. And it's very structured and it's easy flow information and job duties from one person to the next. But it's not. Our healthcare system looks like this. It's very dynamic and very messy, and has a structure to it, but a structure that changes a great deal over time. And so flow doesn't happen as efficiently as we would like it to, and naturally so, because it just isn't set up and structured to look like that. This is an example of some of their work, Christakis and Fowler's work, when they looked at obesity in particular. So they looked at individuals who were clinically diagnosed with obesity based on body mass index. And you can see some clustering when you look. So the yellow dots are those who have a diagnosis of obesity. You can see that there are pockets where they're clustered together. There are other pockets where they're separated. But this is just one example of what their research looked like when they followed people over time. One of the interesting pieces about what they found consistency was that out of all the social networks they looked at, that there was something important about the connection or the linkages. But perhaps even more important, there was something that flowed across those connections. They called it contagion, which I love that word. And we know when we have relationships with people that there's something that flows from one person to the next. And what they showed from the bigger context is that this flow helps shape the networks, and the networks actually shape the people too. It works in both directions, and it ends up creating a life of its own. And we can appreciate this because a work culture, for example, or a work network or an organization has its own culture, so it seems to have a life of its own. And our healthcare system certainly does, our government does, our education system does, all of the big entities, even our families do. They have a life of its own, it feels like, and a culture that's associated with it. And so, getting to the meat of this, perhaps one of the most interesting pieces about this is what they found from their research and other people's research is that on average, every person on the planet is connected by 6 degrees of separation. So that would be, for instance, one person is connected to another, who's connected to another, who's connected to another, on down the line. And that when we say it's kind of a small world, this world seems so small because you get to know people from here and there. Well, it really is. And the original research on this was done in the early 1970s, where randomly a researcher tried to see how many connections, relationship connections, a random person in New Jersey, and this is coincidental, was connected to a random person in Nebraska, where we are. And it found out that there were 6. Well, later, and this is a couple decades later, this study was replicated on a global scale and found out that on average, every person on the planet is connected by an average of 6 degrees of separation. So there's a whole story, I think, on that that's super interesting to talk about. But I think more importantly to our conversation here is that their research consistently found that there were 3 degrees of influence. So, in other words, a friend's friend's friend had an influence back on the first person to a statistically significant degree. So, here I'm going to give you an example of this. So, my wife Nancy and I are would be connected by 1 degree connection. Okay, so that's one connection. My wife Nancy then works with a gal named Jeanette. And so Jeanette and I are 2 degrees connected. And Jeanette has a brother named Joe, lives in Chicago. And Joe and I are 3 degrees connected. I don't know Joe. I've never met Joe before, but we have a statistically significant influence on each other in many ways. And in fact, in every way Christakis and Fowler looked, there was a statistically significant influence from people on each other out to 3 degrees of separation, regardless of if they knew each other or even lived close to each other at all. It was just through the connection and the contagion and the flow that happens between people. So, what their data showed was that every time they looked at anything of attitudes, feelings, and behaviors, and their research particularly focused on political views, but also physical things like weight gain and happiness and creativity. And I would argue compassion, if they studied it, probably would be something similar. But when they looked at those, it was a statistically significant influence because of the flow. So here's what some of their data looks like, particularly on weight gain. First degree connectors have a 45% influence on each other's body weight. So this would be, as my example is, my wife Nancy and I have a 45% influence on each other's body weight. And it makes sense because sometimes, couples, follow trends in their body weight up and down or maintain or whatever. But interestingly, Jeanette, Nancy's her work partner, Jeanette, she and I have a 25% influence on each other's body weight. And her brother Joe, who I don't even know, if he walked in the room, I wouldn't even know what he looked like. We have a statistically significant 10% influence on each other's body weight. And that is just through the power of connection. Looking at it from happiness side, 15, 10, and 6. And I always tell the students, so if you don't think 6% influence on your happiness matters, if I gave each of you, comes from separate research, but if I gave each of you $10,000, it would increase your happiness by just 2%. So your influence on other people's happiness matters to a much greater degree than just $10,000 gift would be. So you can see how something is going on there in our connectedness. And here's just a hypothetical scenario. So let's just say you have 20 social contacts, and that would be 5 friends, 5 coworkers, and 10 family members. And each of those contacts also has 20 contacts, and we're going to assume no overlap, which never happens, but just from making easy math, that would be a 3 degree statistically significant influence on 8,000 people every day. And so you can, if you just, and I have students do this, I have them kind of map out what their social networks look like and how many people are in their social networks, just writing out some names. And you could do this for yourself just to kind of see what that might be. And looking at this from 3 degrees of separation and assuming that other people have a similar number of contacts as you. And so I'm just picking 20 here in this example that, you know, how your happiness level today influences the happiness level of 8,000 people to a statistically significant degree. And that's extraordinary. And we actually see this many times if we think back in history about sometimes how there's a movement, a social movement in something where people feel really good or really bad and gather together. And that movement takes a life of its own and influences people. And we see it in our political system all the time. Those are probably the best examples there. But I don't think that we can underestimate the influence we have. And so that's our kickoff to this, just looking at it from a social science perspective. But if we go over to natural science examples, I think we see this also, and it's hard to unsee it. Once you see it this way, it's hard to unsee it. But looking at something like not as simple, but as critical, I would say it that way, but also simple as our water cycle, that there's a connection pattern on how our water cycle works, just naturally from condensation to precipitation to collection to evaporation and so on, that this continually happens within our ecosystem. And so there's something really important about how water changes but still the essence of it stays the same and has a pattern of connection. So I'm starting with biology. So water, and then if we move to an animal food chain that we've learned about in elementary school, where um, you start at the bottom where our grass grows based on the bacteria and other elements that are in our soil help feed the soil, and that grass is important because a zebra feeds on the grass. And then, just as a way of example, you could use a lion here, but a crocodile feeds on the zebra. And then eventually that crocodile dies, and the vulture feeds on the crocodile, and the vulture dies. And then eventually the decomposition there feeds the soil, and it grows the grass. And there's some story about connection there. And we know that our food chain doesn't exist without connection. Nothing exists in isolation. And that's really the point of this. And once we start seeing it, then we start understanding how important connections are for ourselves, and then start seeing where we're disconnected. And that then relates back to our health in many ways. We look at the staying with biology here, the plant cycle, where you're looking at on the left, where of course, you have fruit with seeds, and then those seeds are in the soil, and they germinate and they sprout and they seed, and the plant grows and it flowers, and then it develops fruit, and the fruit drops and the seeds replant itself. Or you could look at it also from this side of the bee and pollination, and the importance of that life cycle there as well. We see the same cycle over and over when we look at nature, from whether we're looking at it from animal side or a plant side. It runs through a connectedness cycle. Oops. Staying with biology, I'm appealing to your science mind, as I do to my students too, just to drive the point home. If we look at something as basic as our cell structure, and this is a human cell structure we're looking at here, and of course we get to our DNA as all of these components, regardless of size, are connected together, have to work together. If one component doesn't work, then the whole thing doesn't work. And I think there's a very poetic story to that in our lives, where if one piece of our social structure is suffering, the whole social structure suffers in some way. And we see that in healthcare all the time, but we see it, of course, in the larger context of our society. But just to point out, when you look at something like the chromosome there that contains our DNA, that chromosome, interestingly, the ends of the chromosome, these tips of the chromosome, have a protein at the end of it. It's called a telomere. And the telomere you can think of as the plastic cap on the end of your shoelaces. That telomere helps this chromosome's health because it allows it to stay in, to maintain its structure. The telomere can shrink and can grow, actually, but can shrink based on how some of the components we have in our life that influence our life, like stress, can shorten a telomere. Blood sugar levels that aren't controlled, such as in something like diabetes, can shorten the telomere, and all kinds of other things can do that. But when the telomere shortens too much, then the chromosome starts to unravel, just like your shoelace would unravel if that plastic tip wasn't on it, and leads to premature cell death. And so there's a connection story there to our emotional stress, for example, and premature cell death. And I think it's kind of an important and really good example of how things work together, and sometimes we don't see them that way. We see things only in isolation. Just more to the story. I'm gonna perhaps exhaust you with science examples here, but moving from biology to chemistry, if we look at again something as basic and what appears to be very simple but not, the water molecule. So two hydrogens and an oxygen. This is a covalent bond, if you remember that from back in your chemistry days from school, but covalent bonds arise from electrostatic attraction to each other for the same electrons. So hydrogens have electrons, oxygen has electrons, and they're attracted to each other. And when they come together, the new formation, when they come together, has more stability than if they were apart. And there, again, I think there's something very poetic with that. And that a lot of times what our social structure, our social norms push us in directions of individualism, and we need to do things just based on our own merit and our and the way we move forward, and just to give our own credibility. Those things, as our young people experience very heavily now, that individualism isn't so good for our mental health. And I think there's something important to pay attention to about the water molecule, in that when we come together, we have an attraction to each other, just as hydrogen and oxygen do, and we're more stable together than we are when we're apart. And so there's a connection story, I think, in water in many ways. I showed it from a biology side before in the water cycle, but then when we look at it from a chemical side, we see the same thing. And not surprising, water is really important, of course, for our own health and the health of our planet and animals and plants and so forth. Okay, so let's move from chemistry over to physics. If you knew what we were looking at here, you get a gold star. Perhaps some of you do. This is an exploding star, or a supernova, that was captured by the Webb Space Telescope several years ago. I guess this image came out in 2023, so it wasn't that long ago. Uh, but of course, the supernova happened billions of years ago, but this is capturing it from the Space Telescope. The reason I show this is because elemental iron is something that we're all familiar with in some degree. We know that we need iron in our diet, and we can get iron in our diet from eating both plants and animals. We know that iron is important in our bodies. For instance, we have iron in our blood, and we wouldn't be able to carry oxygen in our blood and move that around to the parts of our body that need it without iron. So it is essential to the health of us and on an everyday basis, and the health of our planet. Interestingly, that elemental iron is not something that we can create. It's something that just is. And we have the only place that our Mother Earth was able to get elemental iron was from a supernova that exploded billions of years ago. And it threw elemental iron out into the atmosphere, and that atmosphere was pulled together with gravitational pull, and and developed what we know as the Earth. And at the core of the Earth is elemental iron. And that started the story for us. And so we are living and breathing today because of a supernova that exploded many years, billions of years ago. In fact, there's a connection story there. You would get even a golder star if it's possible, if you knew what this image was. And I am showing it a little bit here from the title. But no, this is not yin and yang. This is interestingly two uh, subatomic particles that are entangled with each other. So if you studied physics, and particularly studied subatomic particles. So particles that are smaller than an atom. So an example of that would be an electron or a photon or a neutron, for instance. When Albert Einstein and his group were doing their work in the early 1900s on physics, they found something that bothered them, and Einstein ended up calling it spooky action at a distance. What they found is what they ended up calling quantum entanglement. And this is when two subatomic particles were connected in a way that when one particle changed, the other did so in the exact same way and simultaneously, but regardless of space and time. So now you might think, okay, if I change something that I have in this hand and it's connected to something in this hand, that maybe, that change can happen at the same time or very quickly. What they found in quantum entanglement, in theory, was that if a photon that's in the light, that's in the room you're in now, is connected to a photon on Mars, and that photon in your light was changed by you turning the light on and off, that same change would happen at the exact same time with its entangled photon on Mars. Now, that is hard for us to wrap our heads around because, again, the space and time component that we're used to living in doesn't make sense. So he called it spooky action at a distance and he stopped studying it. And others still continued, and a physicist named John Bell actually proved it to be true in 1964. But just a couple of years ago, physicists were able to capture for the first time what entangled particles looked like. And so this is an image of that, and so cool that it somehow looks exactly like yin and yang. There's a larger story and a separate conversation I think about what that means. But if you follow quantum computing, this is how they're creating our new, faster, safer way of computing is purposefully entangling subatomic particles so we can transfer information at speeds faster than we can perhaps even imagine at this point. So this is being used and developed in a very practical way now. But for me, this is an important image and an important story because it tells us something about how we're connected, but in ways that are perhaps beyond our understanding at this point. And I think most physicists agree that they really can't fully understand what's going on here. And the old joke, I think, in physics is that if you say you understand quantum mechanics, then it really shows everybody else that you don't understand it because the physicists who actually understand it readily admit that they don't understand it very well. And I think there's also something interesting about that. But the point of this is to say that we connect. This is going back to Christakis and Fowler's work. When you're looking at social networks, we connect with other people in ways that we perhaps quite don't understand or even appreciate, but the connection is still there. If anyone lived in Nebraska, I should have or not just Nebraska, but I just say it because it was outside this window behind me a couple nights ago that we had a solar storm, and these solar flares were allowing us to see very impressive and beautiful northern lights the other night. And that comes from electromagnetic fields of energy that are released from the sun. And so those are sometimes called solar wind, solar flare, solar storms. So in other words, in any case, they're electromagnetic fields of energy that are sent to through the atmosphere, gets into the Earth's atmosphere, and then causes us to see those northern lights. But the interesting thing about this, and this is just another example from a physics side and connected to a biology side, there's a whole separate field of biology called heliobiology that studies the solar and geomagnetic activity on what it does to living organisms. And we know that we see higher rates of depression and heart attacks and serotonin imbalance, which is an emotional hormones for us to balance those behavior changes. When these solar storms happen, we see physical biology changes in people because of it. And again, there's something there of a connection in ways that we perhaps don't quite appreciate. So let's go back to social science for just a second and talk about this from using this electromagnetic field of energy example a little bit further, because there's some really interesting social science related to this. So some people are doing research on what they call social coherence. And this is where you have an alignment in a social network. So thinking about this is not Christakis and Fowler, but these are other people who are doing very similar research, but look at it in a slightly different way. That what is actually flowing from one person to another. We know that through Christakis and Fowler's work that something happens and it has an influence on other people. But what is that something that's happening there that what they're calling a social coherence? One of the ways we can measure something that's happening, and this is the way we see it in research a lot, and it's because it's easy to measure, is heart rate variability. We won't get any of the details necessarily about what heart rate variability means, but it's really easy to measure now. If you're wearing a smartwatch like an Apple Watch, it measures heart rate variability. If you're wearing an Aura ring, that also measures heart rate variability. And we can use that as a surrogate marker to see what's going on with our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Now, without getting into the science of that, when we are in a fight or flight position, when we are in a position where we are highly stressed for some reason, and our body needs to do something about it, that stimulates our sympathetic nervous system. When we're in a rest and relaxation position, then so say you are, getting ready for bed and you're winding down or you're meditating, that's stimulating your parasympathetic nervous system. And knowing that which part of your nervous system you're stimulating is important because we can measure what your electromagnetic vibrations are doing because of that. So I forgot to mention the step here that's important to understand with this, that all living things actually have an electromagnetic field and emit electromagnetic energy. We have the ability, the technology at this point to measure our electromagnetic energy out to 6 feet. So every living thing has this. People do, animals do, plants do. And we all emit this electromagnetic field of energy and we can measure it. But as a surrogate marker, we can look at heart rate variability to see what our internal nervous system is doing and then see what kind of signaling wavelength we're giving out to the rest of the world. So after having said all that, here's something that way I think we can relate to. We've probably all gone into a room before and you can feel an energy level in the room. So maybe you've felt a tension or a heaviness in the room, or maybe you've felt something light and joyful when you come into a room full of people. That is there because you are picking up the electromagnetic fields that are being emitted from the people in the room. Our conversation is going to get weirder than this in a minute, so hang on for a second. But what we're sensing and what we're feeling is something real, and that's we can measure that. And when you map it out, you can see when we're stimulating parasympathetic nervous system, this rest and relaxation, we have smooth electromagnetic energy. If we are stimulating the sympathetic nervous system, we have very jagged fields of energy or markings when we map that out. Okay, so we can influence other people's um, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems just by being present with them. And if we, I see it quite a bit now that I know what I'm looking for. When we get into a situation, I recognize it in myself that if I'm around people who are stressed, I tend to get stressed too, just because of that feeling. So that's a social coherence. Here's some data related to it so you can see this a little bit better. In the upper left, we're looking at two females who sat back to back and thought about each other and were thinking kind thoughts about each other. What ended up happening was that their cardiovascular and respiratory nervous systems started synchronizing, and this is an example of social coherence. They weren't touching, but they were sitting back to back. They were close enough. They were within each other's space. Um, the one in the upper right was a male and female married couple, and this they demonstrated social coherence while they were sleeping. So their cardiovascular and respiratory systems and nervous systems synchronized just by being with each other. They weren't thinking about each other. That was the difference between the last example. But they were in a sleep state, an unconscious sleep state, but their rhythms synced together. On the lower left, we have great examples, many examples of mothers and their babies just after birth and how they sync together their nervous systems. There's a something that's flowing between the two of them that allows their physiology to start synchronizing. This doesn't just happen people to people. In the middle bottom row, you see a boy and his dog who did the very same thing, where when they were together, they were synchronizing their nervous systems together. And then when they were apart, their synchronization stopped. Uh, a, 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 a woman and her horse demonstrated the same thing. And I should add here, I just read it this week. There's been a long ongoing, I wouldn't say it's that long, but it's a couple year ongoing study at looking to see how people synchronize with nature. We know that this happens, that nature has an influence on us. It would be hard for, I think, any of us to admit to not admit, I think, that when we're standing at the ocean, we don't feel something, or looking at the mountains, or looking at the stars on a clear night, or when we go into a forest, that we feel some sense of calm. There is a connection there, and there are electromagnetic vibrations that are happening between us and nature in those instances that change the way we feel. There's research that's now looking at this. And just this week, I read a report that showed that when people thought about a particular tree, I know sounds really weird, but they thought about a particular tree, they were looking at the tree, a live image of the tree. People from all over the world did this at the same time. There was quite the coordinated study, but they thought about this tree and what they call give loving kindness to the tree. The tree started acting differently and actually changed in some of its markers of how the tree was behaving. And so that what that is starting to show is that there is a connection in ways we perhaps don't realize it. But I think in other ways, I think we already probably knew this. I think I probably knew this when I was a kid because my grandma Alice could grow a garden like nobody's business. I mean, she just, when you say people have a green thumb, there's something people talk to their plants, or some, there's a connection between people and nature that sometimes we don't give a lot of credit to. We are actually showing this in varying ways through some science too, and it tells us something about connection. There's also,
Um,
yes.
that also what you were just talking about, like with the tree and stuff, I could see where that also, there's the healing touch and things that people can even do from a distance.
Oh, yeah.
And I can see where that kind of all probably is similar to the tree where those people were thinking about or about that tree, or when we're sending loving kindness to people and we may be miles and miles away, but I can see where that could be that kind of probably comes in and influences. their health positively.
Well, here's a study to show exactly that.
Ah,
So
perfect.
if anybody's a Star Wars fan and you feel the Force, we have research to support that. So there's studies to show that, and this is the red piece in this shows what we're looking at there, where you have people who were together and they were thinking about another person, not only in a loving kindness way. Not only did the people who were together synchronize, but and have social coherence, but the person they were thinking about who was not even close to them was at a distance also synchronized and had social coherence. This is the purpose of me showing you the entanglement example, the quantum entanglement yin and yang image, that there's something that we're connected in ways that we don't perhaps realize. And we do have other really marvelous examples of this type of connection where you have identical twins separated at birth, but they make exactly the same decisions at the same time, like what to wear, what kind of what to study in school, and so forth. Uh, that we know people are entangled, mothers and parents and their kids, the same thing when they're separated at great distances, feel the same thing at the same time. So there's a lot there, and we're just starting to study it and appreciate it. Um, Going back a little bit to actual research on what when we tie this back to relationships and into healthcare, there's a this study was just or this book was just published in the last couple of years by the current co-directors of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, which this study actually started in 1938, if you could imagine. So this is an over 80-year study that continues to collect data and have original participants and now the descendants of those participants. They have people in this study fill out questionnaires, but they also get interviewed by people. And the important part of this is their original primary research question was what makes a good life? And a lot of people look at this as the largest happiness study that's ever been done. But there's many ways to look at this other than happiness. I don't think happiness quite captures what we're looking at here. But um, what they, over the last 80 plus years, they've collected an enormous amount of data. And when you have that amount of data as a statistics person, you can start making some predictions with a fair amount of confidence because you can to answer this question, what makes a good life, you can start weeding out amount of money people make, where they live, what kind of job they have, what kind of car they drive, what kind of house, they live in, all those things that we would perhaps write down as what makes a good life. And when they looked at it from this perspective, and they've done this for decades, continue to come to the same conclusion, and that is good relationships. So the one single factor, and this is from the authors of the book, the current co-directors, the science tells us that cultivating warm relationships of all kinds over and over again throughout life is the single most important factor for health and happiness. Having gone through all of the science of the biology and the chemistry and the physics and looking at social coherence, this now should not be a surprise at all because in my mind, there's something very fundamental about the essence of humanity and life itself about being in relationship and relationships of all kinds. And we're seeing it in this study. And then so then just to kind of finish this out with compassion, um, these are some really, I feel like, important reflection questions I offer to my students to consider about what does this tell us? What does all of this tell us about the nature of connectedness and relationships? When we look at this from the larger story, can we take a step back from all of this science for a minute and combine with that our lived experience and our intuition? Um, is this painting a bigger picture, telling a larger story about what connectedness and relationships mean about life? What does this tell us about compassion, particularly when we're looking at it not just in a healthcare situation, but compassion from our personal relationships as well. Um, from a healthcare side, what does this tell us about relational care, which is the language I kind of like to use, versus transactional care, which is what I think many of us have experienced and work in our healthcare system. And is there a pattern and larger story to our lives that we may not recognize as important relative? I think those are all important questions to consider when we're looking at the data like this. Um, so that's kind of it. And oh my goodness, Jeannie, I never finish on the mark, and I'm just right about there. I think we were wanted to open it up to questions, but just from a conclusive side to this, and I'll just take these slides off of here, that it seems to me that there's something fundamental about our connectedness that doesn't seem to get expressed in our healthcare system in ways that it should. Now, certainly there are pockets for sure. But in general, the structural nature of our system doesn't necessarily allow for connection. And in fact, in many times promotes disconnection, particularly among healthcare providers to connect with their patients and to be with their patients. And I think pulling that out of the healthcare system, looking at it in the larger context, I think society has moved forward in that way as well. And this was the crux of the book that I wrote called Chronically American that really outlined our disconnected story over time, over the last few hundred years. And so there's something I think to pay attention to and recenter us on what our essence perhaps might be. So let's maybe open this up to questions and conversation, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for your attention and all of this.
Tom, I was talking with you earlier about the psychology aspects of stuff, and I remember when I was going through school a million years ago, we had kind of the Carl Rogers model, and now we have all this cognitive behavioral stuff. And Carl Rogers essentially just sat with people providing this unconditional positive regard. He had really no other interventions other
Wow.
than that he really exuded, I guess, love and care for the people. And now, um, so much of the psychology training is, we have to prove to people that they're thinking wrong, that their thoughts are irrational. We have to have all these gizmos and gadgets and all this kind of stuff. And it's taken it so far away from a personal connection. And it's kind of interesting to me because I know just in my practice, the people that I thought got better were just the people that I just liked so much.
Yeah,
I
that's
don't
right.
know. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for just being kind to people and listening to their story. And I think that's really healing and counseling.
Well, that's a really good comment, Steph. And here's my when I get to the end of the sequence for my students, this is the primary question I ask them.
Mhm.
What do you think after looking at all of this science data? What do you think is flowing from one person to the next? Describe that for me. And we, of course, look at it as well. It's electromagnetic energy or it's, you know, something. But let's talk about what that might be. And I allow them to do it in a way that's a bit non-threatening. So they write reflection papers on it. So I get to read all of those. And I'm really pleased, and I just love it when students start going down the space of saying, could this be love?
Mhm.
Is this what love is? And the reason I like that is this is something, when I say, oh, Tom Lenz, I love the Chicago Cubs, that kind of thing, baseball
Mhm.
team, Chicago Cubs. Well, I mean, yes, there's something there of a sentimentality, but I think we're moving in a much more in a deeper, a different way of a different kind of love, but maybe something similar, but certainly in a different way of whatever flows from that. So then I ask them to keep going with that. Where is that love coming from, and what does this look like? And I'm really happy when students get to the space of saying, is that God? Could that be God? in whatever context, religious tradition context is
Mhm.
there something of connection story there relative to our spirituality and if our essence is something related, if God's essence is something related to relationship, wouldn't it make sense that our essence is as well? So that's a really helpful, I think, for some of the students to try to move beyond their science because then it gives them a new purpose, maybe a different purpose, an enhanced purpose of working with patients in a new way that there's something beyond me that's going on here when I really connect with somebody, that there's this level of love that's flowing and perhaps if they can embrace it, this is God flowing between people.
Mhm.
Any other questions? Tom, when you talked about the energy in a room or um, when you're with people, and you can gather that sometimes even in an online kind of environment. But it is kind of cool when you walk into a room and sometimes you're like, wow, just the energy in here is great, or sometimes it can be negative, but when you feel that energy, and I'm sure we've all felt that. And one of the things that the comments that we always get with our Time to Heal classes when we say what was the most valuable part of this class, whether it be a virtual class or an in-person class, it's always the connection with the other people because they've all had similar experiences, and but people really get it in that connection, and they often will keep meeting later on their own for years afterwards, but they make that connection, and that's always the number one thing that's the
Yeah.
most beneficial for people is that
Yeah.
connection.
Well, and we hear people talk about this, but the data also supports it. When somebody retires, and they say, "What are you going to miss about your job?" It's usually not, "Oh, I'm going to miss all the accolades I get. I'm going to miss all the productivity that I've been able to do. I'm going to miss all of the money I made for this company." That's rarely ever the case. People are going to miss the people.
Yeah.
And I think that again gets to this notion of essence. But yes, talking about the flow, just come to the Creighton campus during finals week and you'll experience what that feels, what tension feels like.
I
You know
just
what?
found this very, very helpful, all the information, and I would really like to be involved in more classes or meetings on connectedness. And um, I don't, I kind of need time to process. I feel like there was just so much information provided. That was really helpful.
Oh,
Thank
thank you. That is such kind words. Thank you so much. It's a lot to digest, and it is the reason why I spread this out over a bit of time for our students, because and I have them write reflection papers about it because it's just a lot to take in. If you're working in a clinic and that clinic is giving so many examples of disconnectedness, and then you look at it in this way and say, what we really should be doing this. There's a lot to come to terms with about what can I do personally? What can we do within the system to change things? But I know that's getting off topic from your um, comment, Candace, but I appreciate the nice words there. And yeah, it's a lot to digest.
I think it's great that medical students and dental students and things are getting this connection information and this compassionate care education, because like Steph said, the people that she really liked were the ones that really got better, or you think about even your providers, it's like when you've got a good connection with that provider, you just feel more comfortable and going and what have you, but and probably listen to them better and do what they tell you better too if you like them.
It takes from a healthcare professional side, it takes a lot of unlearning because if you think about our education system is all based on the individual. We only get evaluated based on individual. It promotes individuals. We know individualism is only continuing to escalate in its prominence. And It's one of the reasons why we feel like there's mental health issues in our young people is because of the pressures of individualism and the promotion of that um, and losing that balance between individual, who you are as an individual and who you are as a collective and having a balance there. But there's a lot of unlearning that goes on because you can imagine someone who is someone who is who's a medical student is, one of the best at playing the game of being a student.
Mhm.
They're really good at playing that game. Not that they're saying they're not smart because they are, but they're really good at that piece of it. And so there's a lot of unlearning to come to this collective
You
notion.
know, it's interesting too, Tom. There's I don't remember exactly where this was, but it's someplace in the Midwest here, and they had a huge absentee rate in junior high kids. And I'm thinking how this applies to education as well. And all they did this intervention that cost no money. What they did was they got a list of all the kids that were like absent chronically, and they gave it to all of the teachers in the building. And they asked all of the teachers to say something to those kids by name every time they saw them. So, hi, Tom, how are you? Or it's good to see you, Tom, whether they had him in class or not. And just that intervention alone improved the absentee rate by something like 30%. And it just has to,
Cool.
I was thinking like in terms of education, so many of us grew up in those things where, everything that you did wrong was noted, but nothing that you did right, unless you were the
Yeah.
A student and you always got singled out for having the best paper, which could be embarrassing too, in grade schools and that. But anyway, I just think, again, it's like we learn best from mentors who like us rather than from teachers who tell us everything that we do wrong. Um, I don't know. I mean, I just think there's so much about even the way that we discipline children, the way that we teach children. Discipline seems to be punitive in so many cases, where really it should mean sort of like, I don't know, kind of gently moving people along, helping them. But I don't know, it has so many applications, and it's not exactly, Jeannie, not exactly like only the people that I liked got better, but the more that I
Yeah, I
liked
know.
them, and then I found myself kind of like praying for those people or thinking about those people, and they were in my thoughts. And I just think, we have that special connection to some people, and whether it's like I don't know, there's some need in them that corresponds to something of ours, maybe it's even Tom, I wonder like sometimes like some of us do better with certain kinds of people, regardless of what it is. Our personalities just sync better, and if you have somebody who's sympathetic to you in that way, maybe you've been through the same thing, or I don't know. Anyway, but I love this connection, and we started doing this in A Time to Heal. Now we have in our new book, we have this whole thing on heart rate variability and just that breathing in and out of your heart through love, that little simple exercise that they teach people.
Mm,
And it's so powerful for people when they can do that. It's this way to calm yourself down, and then that helps your whole environment too.
for
It's kind of
sure.
like creating a therapy dog of yourself so that you move in and wag your tail to everybody. It's good.
Kim, it looked like you wanted to ask a question, did you? Sorry, or comment.
No, I think I'm coming at it from a different perspective. I'm not a therapist. I have been historically a professional in organizational effectiveness, but also a cancer survivor. And, you mentioned the mental health crisis that we're in. And I think this is all important information about the value of connection. It's one of the critical elements of Maslow's hierarchy. The issue I'm finding is creating connection is virtually impossible for me in today's world, for a variety of reasons. I think most people look at you like a mirror. So if you are a high achiever, it's very difficult to meet new people.
Mm,
And in the cancer support groups, I made the mistake of not joining a group, to be honest with you. I had inflammatory breast cancer or have. Um, and I went through the whole thing and continued to work. Kind of like, I've got this, everybody, don't worry about it. So no one has ever worried about it. And then when it was over, I kind of crashed and burned and had a lot of resentment towards the people in my life for not stepping up and trying to take the reins from me. At the same
yeah.
time, I think I made it difficult. So I think it's really important for a course like this to be almost like the precursor to teaching people on both perspectives, like how do you show up for others and how do you create these connections? Because the importance of it is so clear. I mean, you just gave a lot of amazing information on the validity of that. But the bigger issue is the how, because
Wow.
that's what I'm struggling with, to be honest with you. And I literally just moved to Port St. Lucie, Florida, and about a week later, there was an announcement like it's the absolute worst place in the world to live if you're
Oh
single and
no.
trying to develop new friendships and connections. And for me, as an executive woman, coming from a lifelong of trauma, so I'm familiar with the cognitive behavior therapy and all of the things that we're trying to feed to the world right now. But I think the whole world needs this, truly. Not just the importance of realizing how important it is, but how do you do it?
Yeah. And that's such, I mean, that is the million-dollar question. I mean, how do you do it? Because it's academia is really good about saying what it is, but not the solution. And so we're working on that on our end. We've got I feel like a way forward. That's what the relational care course is about for our M4 students. And mostly because I say to them, okay, your life is about to hit the fan. I mean, as a resident.
Yeah.
And so I walk them through the perennial wisdom pattern of order, disorder, and reorder. And we're really good at understanding the order part. And you can think of that as your education, if you're a really good student. And then so you're about to enter the disordered part where you're into the healthcare system and you got to use your education, but it's going to be really challenging in lots of ways. What we're used to doing or our default to do when we're in a disordered state is to either run away or we project it onto other people. And neither are the right way. It's sitting with it, allowing it to teach us something while we sit there with it and be patient with it. And that's really hard to do. And that takes some skills to be able to do. So we work through that's a
Are
really
courses like this required for med students? I think it's wonderful if it is, to be honest with you. And I think back to some of my own experiences at Yale and the way some of the doctors were, they completely stripped me of my humanity
yeah,
in multiple situations. And when you don't have a personal support group outside of the hospital, you're kind of counting on these doctors because they're saving your life. But if they don't see you as a life, it
yeah.
makes you feel really uncomfortable about how to trust them and proceed forward. So I love that this is a course that's available. I'm wondering if it's mandatory.
It's not yet.
Yeah, it
It's
should
not
be.
yet. Yeah, we're working on that. That's a complex thing, as you might imagine. But
Oh, yeah.
yes, we're only in the second year of offering it. So I think what administration wanted to see was a demonstration of its effectiveness and, you know, but hopefully we'll get to that point.
Well, it's
I
a great
agree,
marketing opportunity. When you look at the mental health crisis, classes like this will be exactly what we need as a society to change that.
Mm,
I
yeah, thank
agree
you.
with what you're saying, and I'm not familiar with what's being taught now in counseling programs. I think this kind of class is really important. I've been a therapist and in practice for over 40 years. So, and I see this as being really helpful. I'm still practicing to part-time, and and I'm also a cancer survivor. But I see this as being really, really helpful. I've felt a flow. I've often felt a flow, and I've seen when clients get better and this feeling of connection. I've I can be so obtuse sometimes. I've never thought of it
Mhm.
on an actual physical level when you were talking about uh, atomic, atomic particles and electromagnetic fields and actual stuff um, being emitted uh, between people. I've just never thought of it that way. I've just thought love and kindness and it's a feeling and a flow, but I've never thought of it on a physical level. And I just think that's really interesting.
Thank
That's
you.
all I had to say. Oh,
No, thank you.
The only thing I would say, in terms of connection, I know like for myself, my strongest connections have always come through volunteer work. And I think it's because um, when you go into most volunteer organizations, and I'm not talking like one-time things where you take your turn, working at the soup kitchen, but it's like, when you get into some kind of volunteer work, you really get a good sense of who the other people are and like who actually shows up, who actually cares, who's just there to put in the service hours, that kind of thing. And I've made such good lifelong friends with that. And I think the other thing is that like when you're going into a volunteer work, all the hats are off. I mean, you can have a CEO and a stay-at-home mom and all these different people all working together. So all of your roles are sort of off and you come in just as people working on a project. So I don't know if that would be at all helpful to Kim or to anybody else, but it can be hard because even when you do that, some people just want to put in their hour and leave. But it's like who's there or other kinds of organizations, book clubs, things where you're talking about things where I don't know, because I think that does start that flow that you're talking about. You're all there for a similar purpose, and that kind of generates some respect and fun together.
Agree.
Good idea.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Lenz. I can't thank you enough. And again, to all of you, this gentleman is one of the kindest, most compassionate people I know and have the pleasure to work for. But I also wanted to give you a heads up or a plug-in for our December Create Your Best Life, which will be the Saturday, December 13th. And the topic is alcohol's cancer connection, how to raise your glass without risk. So we will get some of the information on alcohol's connection with cancer, but then there's also going to be some fun like mocktail recipes and things. So please feel free to join us if you can. Again, that's December 13th. And I will stop the recording for now.
I just wanted to mention something to Kim. I wondered as far as connectedness, I found the survivor